Hello and welcome to the July episode of What's in It for Africa. More milk? In this episode, we're going to be going inside the issue of ending the EU's 30-year-old milk quota regime. And to help us to do so, we've spoken to Member of the European Parliament, Maria Noichl, the Deputy Secretary General of the ACP. He's responsible for Economic Sustainable Development and Trade, Mr. Viwanou Gnassounou, and consultant at GD Partners and senior advisor at the Ramphal Institute's Agro-food sector programme, Dr. Paul Goodison. So, before we get to that, let's start with giving you a rundown of all of the EU policy updates happening in Brussels to do with Africa. So this month, the European Commission published an outline of some of the initiatives that it's going to be bringing forward over the next few years. So we had a look and figured out what would be interesting for Africa. There is a piece of EU legislation which protects the EU from subsidies and pricing practices against air service suppliers which are actually based outside of the European Union. Now, this piece of legislation is set to be revised at the end of the year. And this is part of a wider strategy to improve the EU's aviation sector, which basically focuses on looking at how the EU can solidify its position as a global service provider of aviation services. Now, let's move on to the European Parliament. This month, the European Parliament, which is the legislative arm of the European Union, adopted a strategy to enforce its intellectual property rights against third countries. One key aspect of the strategy is that it will support developing countries in order to boost their own intellectual property system. And finally, the European Union will also seek to make regular recourse to dispute settlement mechanisms, such as those under the World Trade Organization. So moving on from the Parliament and towards agreed trade deals, this month the European Union signed a fisheries agreement with Liberia. Now what this means is the European Union can fish 6,500 tonnes of tuna and other migratory species from Liberian waters, and in return the EU will compensate Liberia €650,000 a year. Now 50% of this fund is earmarked in order to improve the Liberian fisheries industry. Let's move on to inside the issue. This month it's all about more milk. On the 1st of April, the European Union ended its 30-year-old milk quota regime. Now this was originally implemented in order to manage the rise in milk production. In Africa, this demand is certainly growing, up 22% in 6 years. And in some regions, for instance in West Africa, there is also 90% of the dairy product market that is actually made up from imports from third countries. So now you have the background, let's go and speak to the experts and find out what's in it for Africa.
Das Ende der Milchquote in Europa, was hat das mit Afrika zu tun? Gibt es hier überhaupt Überschneidungen? Jawohl, die gibt es. Zu glauben, dass das Ende der Milchquote nur ein Problem in Europa ist, dass hier Milchbauern vielleicht mit sinkenden Preisen zu kämpfen haben und der Markt überschwemmt wird wieder mit Milch, das ist zu kurz gesprungen. Wir wissen, dass der Markt bis nach Afrika mit Milch überschwemmt werden wird und dass die afrikanischen Märkte auch darunter leiden werden, wenn wir in die Überproduktion gehen. Wir haben zwei klare Botschaften. Wir brauchen keine Überproduktion und wir wollen nicht die Märkte in Afrika überschwemmen. Denn unabhängig werden, selbstständig werden, braucht vor allen Dingen einen eigenen Markt und den braucht man für Afrika und dafür trete ich ein.
Next up we have Dr. Paul Goodison. He's a consultant at GDC Partners and senior advisor on the Ramphal Institute's Agro-food sector programme. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Thank you. To help us understand a bit more about the EU dairy sector, but also its relationship or interest in Africa, can I just ask you to give us an idea about what's been happening in the EU and why Africa in particular is of growing interest?
2014 was a very interesting year for the European dairy sector. You had a situation where China, which had been the major growth market, imports began to slow down. And that affected everybody. It led, for example, to a 50% decline in skim milk powder prices and generally depressed international dairy markets. In August then, we had a development which fell particularly heavily on the EU dairy sector, which was the Russian import embargo. In 2013, Russia had been the major export market for EU dairy products. Then, of course, the situation in the Ukraine, deteriorating relations in the Russian import market, closed that major market for the EU. At the same time, we had a situation where European dairy companies were preparing for the abolition of European milk production quotas after 30 years. And they were investing in lots of new capacity to provide bulk dairy commodities to international markets. So we had a situation where Europe was facing a decline in demand and expanding production at a time of very low world market prices. Fortunately, they'd been preparing the ground for these major changes in EU policy, the abolition of production quotas, and had started investing in Africa, which is seen as having enormous potential for growth in dairy consumption. You have to bear in mind that the major traded commodity is milk powders. It's not fresh milk. That's the basis of international trade, milk powders, butter and cheese. And these milk powders coming into Africa can substitute for fresh milk in the production of processed dairy products.
So against this background of EU-Africa kind of trade and investment engagement and also the growing consumer demand within the continent, do you think, or what are the opportunities actually that are likely for African dairy producers? Are there any, and what are the most interesting?
You have to bear in mind that we're now getting more competition between companies in West Africa, so it's getting a very cutthroat and competitive environment in the dairy sector. So we could see a situation where efforts locally to develop milk production in West Africa are being undermined by this massive increase in milk powder exports. In last year alone, milk powder exports, skim milk powder exports from Europe increased 59%. And a lot of that found its way onto African markets. A lot in terms of local African demand, small in terms of the global scale of European exports. If we look in East and Southern Africa, we have much more firmly established milk to dairy supply chains, including with smallholder farmers participating. So in some respect, the threat to local milk producers is even greater, because that competitive imbalance between the costs of local milk production and getting that milk to the dairies, particularly from smallholder producers, and importing milk powders in bulk and reconstituting, the competitive pressures put local milk producers at a great disadvantage at the current time, given the low prices. So there's a lot of concern in in countries with established dairy sectors that the current market situation could basically undermine milk production in Africa.
Considering the increase of EU milk production because of the ending of the quota, do you think this is a good or bad thing for Africa?
Well, it's a good and a bad thing for Africa. In the short term, meeting consumer demand, you don't want to put too much of a restraint on imports. In the longer term, you don't want this wave of European milk powder, which by the way will double in the next 10 years in terms of the export volumes. Wow. You don't want that wave just washing away local African producers. In this context, it's a tricky dilemma, because what's small beans, small fry for European exporters can have a profound effect on small African markets. Yeah. So if you look at the big picture, Africa might not look that important, but if you reverse that telescope and look from the other side, it looks like there's this enormous European dairy export potential on the horizon, and small African farmers in particular will struggle to compete. That means governments have got to make some difficult policy choices. How do they manage imports in ways that support the long-term development of local milk production and local milk to dairy supply chains. And this is going to pose real problems, because some of the things which are coming up in terms of new trade agreements, like the economic partnership agreement signed with the EU, could restrict their ability to use the traditional policy tools which they've used.
So now we're at the ACP offices here in Brussels. That's the offices for the African, Caribbean and Pacific group of states. We have the pleasure of being joined by the Deputy Secretary General, Mr. Viwanou Gnassounou. He's actually responsible for sustainable economic development and trade and has extensive experience of policy formulation in the agricultural sector. What has been, or what do you think is the best plan of action in terms of the policies that African governments can put in place in order to guard themselves against some of the sort of more negative implications of the ending of the EU milk quota?
Yes, thank you. No, the impact of this decision for African countries will be really to see how the growth of our dairy sector can be maintained despite what is happening in Europe. So a plan of action should be a plan which takes into account the fact that we need to produce locally, because the path we are taking is to develop, not only to have the raw materials, but to have it processed, because that's where the value is, and to develop this the value chain in the sector. Any plan of action should take into account the necessity to protect the market, the African market, from I would say arrival of a massive quantity of EU milk. So that will request some tariff measures, and I'm aware that in many of our regions already they have some safeguard measures, or they have some tariff rates which is set to protect against the arrival of this kind of products. So there won't necessarily be need to have a new measures, but we have to activate those measures or to follow closely the implementation of action. The second aspect will be to try to take the opportunity of the experience from the EU sector. The sector have been protected for 30 years. They have some good experiences developed, and we can invite or see how best we can use this experience, bringing them to Africa and developing the milk sector locally. As part of our plan of action, what we can also envisage is to see a strategy to attract the EU investors with experience in the sectors, but not working on EU milk, but African produced milk, just to process it and to make it available for the African local market. And the third part will be, of course, to work more or to encourage and to assist the ACP, the African milk sector, to continue with what is going on now, which is investing massively in processing the milk and developing a market locally and with local resources.
Keeping the concentration on the African side, what role do you see for regional integration in terms of protecting Africa or the dairy sector? And actually, I suppose it's a wider question about protecting African industry when policy changes are made from the EU side. Do you see that regional integration can actually help African countries to better trade between their neighbours and therefore maybe withstand some of the shocks that happen at the European Union level?
Well, definitely, because if you plan a response in, I would say, put it properly, tiny territory, and of course you do not have, I just mentioned the economy of scale, you do not have it. But if you need to develop a response to what's happening here, you need the space, you need a good number of consumers to do that. So definitely regional integration or the largest possible economic zone would be necessary to respond to that. But also in some regions like ECOWAS, we have the common external tariff, which enable the region as a whole to have a common measure against what's happening here. And that will strengthen the regional organization, because you protect your market, not one country against another, but because if it is one country against another, of course, the people outside your zone will play one against the others. But now you have, like in West Africa, you have the ECOWAS plus Mauritania having a common national tariff. So you have a huge territory which enables you to develop an industrial policy which can be sustainable economically and socially as well. So yes, regional integration definitely is the best approach to respond to the situation.
The ending of the EU milk quota, what's in it for Africa?
Let's say challenges. Challenges, but we used to have a sort of predictable environment in Africa compared, in the case of the milk sector. The EU decision, even though it was a bit foreseen, because having delays since 2003, 2008 and 2015 now, it just happened end of March 2015. But it's coming with new challenges but we can also see opportunities. I used to say when you're facing challenges, then you can develop your all the potential that you have. So our countries have a lot of potential. We're not using all of them. So now we are facing challenges in terms of being invaded by the possible surplus from the EU market, and will be cheaper in terms of production costs, because there's no more quota, there's no more levy to pay. So they might arrive at a lower price, and our countries have to demonstrate the capacity to protect their own market, but at the same time develop internally the capacities of our dairy sector for our processors to take the full potential of what is in there for them to produce and to make available good quality product for our consumers.
That's it for the July episode, What's in it for Africa? More milk. I hope that we were able to give you political insights into how the ending of the EU milk quota affects the African dairy sector. And next month is August, so we'll be bringing you a summer special. But don't worry, in September we'll be back in full force, and we'll be looking at the EU transparency rules on conflict minerals. Until then, subscribe on YouTube, follow on Twitter, and check out the new website. And thanks for watching What's in it for Africa.